So I'm Dr. Olga Onuch, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. As some of you who were here yesterday know, that this is part of a two-day event, EU-Ukraine relations, a workshop, Quo Vadis, what's to come between Ukraine and the EU. And we would like to thank all of the participants who have spent the last 2 days, one of them on this side of the room, who have spent the last 2 days debating, discussing research policy practices, visitors from Ukraine, from within the UK, and a few from further abroad. I would like to just thank all of the sponsors of both the workshop and especially the annual lecture. So we have the Jean Monnet Centre for Excellence here in Manchester that has helped us put on the event today, and specifically this lecture, but also the Department of Politics, the School of Social Sciences, CRES at SALC, and very importantly, the Ukrainian Institute in London has supported us both financially and in a variety of other ways, and we're very thankful to them. So I will now pass on the microphone, well, he's mic'd up, to my colleague, Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou.
Okay, thanks very much to everybody for coming and for braving this tropical weather today to spend your afternoon with us. My name is Dimitris Papadimitriou. I'm the director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. For those of you who are not familiar with what we do, the centre unites the research and teaching strengths of various schools at the University of Manchester, but also of Manchester Metropolitan University, to put together lectures and seminars and other activities whose main aim is to promote understanding on Europe. Clearly, we haven't done a very good job because, as you all know, Britain will be leaving the European Union in a few months' time, but we still consider it our responsibility to engage with what's going on in the European Union and Europe more generally. And in the past few years, we've been naturally consumed by the issue of Brexit, but Brexit is not the only problem that Europe faces. And in the past, we were very privileged to host high-profile events at the centre, including 3 former prime ministers last year. The Queen's constitutional advisor gave a talk to us. But this year, in particular, we are delighted to be shifting our attention to Ukraine. It's an important issue for Europe, for Ukraine, of course, and for many Ukrainians who live in this country. And we are particularly delighted to introduce Sergii Leshchenko to give the 2017-18 annual lecture. Sergei is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament. And for many years he's been one of the leading investigative journalists in the Ukraine, collaborating with the Ukrainian Pravda, amongst other things, and helping to highlight issues of corruption, censorship, and other important challenges to Ukrainian democracy over the past few years. Sergei was, of course, one of the leading leaders of the EuroMaidan revolution in Ukraine, and many of you would probably have heard of his name in that context, but that's not the only thing he's done. He's continuing to do excellent work, both in Ukraine and abroad. He's been the recipient of many different awards. I won't list them all, they're all very good, and from many different countries, which tells you something, I guess. And he is most recently identified by Focus as one of the most influential people in Ukraine, in a good way. So we are delighted to introduce Sergei to Manchester. We very much look forward to your talk. Sergei has agreed to speak for 30-40 minutes max, and then we will have plenty of time to get questions from the audience. Never hesitate to ask questions here. We like it. We don't expect expert questions, but we like all of our speakers to be subjected to some good Mancunian scrutiny of for everything they have to say. So again, on behalf of the steering group of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre, and for all the participants here, Sergei, welcome to Manchester, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a huge honor for me to stay here and to have this lecture. I'm traveling a lot during the last few months in Britain. I was in Reform Club in January, then I was in Cambridge and Oxford, and today I'm here in Manchester University to have this annual lecture, and I would like to share my experience, my knowledge, and to hear your not only questions but recommendations how to make Ukraine great again. Let's say this way. So Ukraine and UK, there are not just neighbors in the list of countries, but letter U in our country's names leave the room for U-turn in our political development. And the Ukraine made such U-turns a few times during our short history, and your country now also facing big U-turn to leave European Union. But we hope these changes will not change your approach toward Ukraine, and we will see Britain as one of the main friends of Ukraine on the international arena. And our country is also facing some challenges now, but the nature of this challenge is very different. I would like to speak about Ukrainian challenges, but of course before my short introduction, I would like to quote Jean Monnet. It's a Jean Monnet lecture, so one of the most famous quotes is very relevant with the Ukrainian situation now. People only accept changes when they are faced with necessity, and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. So this is what is going on in Ukraine now. Ukraine became independent in 1991, but during first, let's say, 2 decades of our history, changes were not really impressive. And when we talk about changes of last 3-4 years, I can say that this is the biggest improvement since independence. Of course, we could achieve much more, but the most famous analog or metaphor we use, we're saying that glass is partly full rather than partly empty, and this is usually true because Ukraine has something to present and even to share our experience. At the same time, Ukrainian society is still looking for much more changes, much better improvement of the life and of institutional changes. So, crisis created challenges but also opportunities to start the new page of reforms in Ukraine. And to overview current situation, I would like to start with explanation what is Ukraine about. So Ukraine is a country on the crossroad. This is a geopolitical crossroad between Europe and post-Soviet world, and at the same time this is a crossroad of values between democracies and authoritarian regimes on the east. Ukraine is also the crossroad between commodity-based economies and high-tech economies. Ukraine has crossroad inside the country, crossroad of generation in the politics. And if you look on the Ukrainian Parliament, you can find some members who are sitting there since independence. One of members of Parliament, he was elected first time maybe in 1991, 1990. So for him it is a eighth term in Parliament. In current Parliament we have a lot of new faces. At the same time, new faces doesn't mean that it's enough to create new momentum inside the politics. So what Ukraine is good that we have this movement. movement from civil society, from media, from non-government organization into politics. This is what is absent in Egypt or in Tunisia, and this was of big mistakes made these countries after their revolutions, because in politics it's very simple. As more good people join politics, as less room for bad people in the politics. So in Parliament we have limited number of changes, and as many good members of Parliament there is less room for bad people to create politics in Ukraine. So in this sense, decision of big group of Ukrainian civil society activists to join politics was completely right. And mistake was that it's not enough. It happened because political system is created on the same rules, the same electoral legislation, and the same principles inside the politics. Why it happened, it's a long discussion, but I believe all changes are possible if there is so-called sandwich, when there are three levels for make changes possible. First level, it is demand of society. This is grassroots pressure, when society wants to change their lives and want to change political principles. In Ukraine, what we have now, it's completely unique for our history. We have very strong demand of society to fight against corruption. For instance, if you look on the numbers of the recent polls, there are two main issues for Ukrainians. 41% say that war in the East is the main problem, and 40% says corruption is the main problem for Ukraine. So it means that corruption became one of the top two topics for Ukrainian citizens during the last few years. Because if we look back, in the time of previous president, people just did not care about corruption at all. It was quite status quo situation when political leadership headed by ousted President Yanukovych, they were just stealing money from budget and enjoying their personal paradises built somewhere on the riverside of Ukraine in residence called Межигір'я. If you have a chance to visit Kiev, please spend a few hours in this open door museum of corruption. They built their personal paradises on the Côte d'Azur in France, or in London, or in Spain. So there are many areas around the world there where they spending their money stolen from budget, and only one Ukrainian top-ranked politician paid the price for this, former Prime Minister Lazarenko, who was sentenced for 8 years, but not by Ukrainian judges, but by American judges, who was sentenced for 8 years in jail in California. So what changed now? That now society cares a lot about corruption, and this is very necessary to make changes possible. So this is first level of our sandwich. Second level of sandwich is institutions. What we have now, we have quite controversial situation when institutions created after Revolution of Dignity, they are just new build. Some of them quite strong, like Anti-Corruption Bureau. Some of them weak or unsuccessful, like Prevention Agency on Corruption or judicial system. And some institutions are not reformed at all, like Prosecutor General Office, for instance. But it's not possible to make reforms without institutions. That is why second level of our changes is still not cooked well. And the top level of the sandwich, it is leadership. Impossible to make reforms without leadership, especially in such young countries like Ukraine is. In this situation, I believe we have very slow dynamic of changes of minds in the heads of our leadership. So I believe Ukraine could achieve much more if our leadership, frankly speaking, our president paid much more attention on reforms and much less attention on personal business or political profits. In this situation of three levels of political sandwich, we achieved what we achieved Now we have 4 years after changes of power. So next month is going to be 4 years anniversary of new president elected, and we can have some opinion what happened, what achieved, and what could be achieved more. I believe this dynamic of reforms now it's not very fast because we are facing new elections next year, and of course if you run long distance marathon you cannot keep the same speed during the whole distance. The room for changes, the room for reforms is not very long. It's about 1 year, 9 months after changes of power. It's not possible to have the same dynamic of reforms on the 4th or even 5th year of changes. Now it's a 5th year of changes of power in Ukraine. That is why we have less and less speed of reform and more populist minds in the Ukrainian Parliament. But let me come back to my crossroad explanation. So I believe Ukraine is also on the crossroad between corruption-based politicians and vibrant civil society. So this is what is going on in Ukraine now, when this crossroad created some problems for old elites. At the same time, it created some problems for civil society fighting against corruption, because old elites, they cannot keep this status quo anymore because there are too many watchdogs and whistleblowers inside the system makes troubles for them. At the same time, revenge of old elites and revenge of corrupt politicians is also on the table in Ukraine, and we have number of, let's say, worst example of legislation adopted during last time, like electronic declaration for anti-corruption civil society individuals accepting international financial support. For my personal opinion, this is directly took from recipe book of Mr. Putin. Why? Because in Russia there is a so-called foreign agents law. In Ukraine, such obligation to fill electronic declarations, they are not for each anti-corruption activist. No, only for them who accept money from international donor organization. So I believe this is the worst Ukraine could make for civil society, instead of support them, to make kind of vendetta against them. So Ukraine is a country creating good news. I don't want to describe everything in dark colors, and there are a lot of things happened in Ukraine which are positive. I believe there is no more uncertainty for the integration of Ukraine. For today, we have 52% of Ukrainians in favor of joining European Union. This is the numbers of recent social polls. And these numbers are not changed. Even in autumn 2015, so just 1 year after new president elected, we had 57%. So the same level of numbers. Almost 4 years, we have the same level of support of integration into European Union. It is not less than 50%. And this is one of the big good news from Ukraine. So Ukrainian society is Euro-optimist society. In this sense, let us not to take into account your experience and your opinion on Euro pessimism, because we still have to do a lot to improve our legislation and our political traditions, and to use European integration as a main stick and carrot instrument to make the changes. So if Ukraine made progress, it's done because we have this stick and carrot combination, when from one side to have money from international community, international organization, or to have visa liberalization, Ukraine has to improve legislation and to prosecute corrupt individuals. The same instruments of stick and carrot were used in Romania or Bulgaria or Poland when these countries declared their integration into European Union. Ukraine is not aspiration for European Union now, but the same stick and carrot relations with European Union made a lot of changes in Ukraine possible. Another good news from Ukraine is institutional changes. So for today, we established a number of institutions which demonstrate completely different dynamic, completely different approach and values comparing to old one. First, I would like to mention Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU. This abbreviation is quite well known, maybe even in this audience. Who knows Anti-Corruption Bureau or NABU among of you? Yeah, number of people knows. This is anti-corruption agency to fight against high-level corruption, to prosecute political individuals, and this was built from the grassroots level. So I'm member of anti-corruption committee in Parliament, and our committee was the main committee to prepare this anti-corruption bureau. We decided not to reform Prosecutor General office from inside. It's impossible. We decided to build something new because we had so long experience of unsuccessful reform from inside. And when we decided to build something new, it worked. Anti-Corruption Bureau for today prosecuted head of fiscal service, the close cronies of former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, like Mr. Martynenko, the members of current parliament like Polyakov and Rosenblatt, and so on and so forth. This was completely unbelievable. Few years ago, that members of current coalition can be prosecuted by one of the anti-corruption law enforcement agencies. But now it's reality. And of course, it made Anti-Corruption Bureau target for attacks from different sides. So it's attacked from members of parliament, from fake organizations in civil society, from media, they attacked from presidential office and so on. But they survived. As for today, I can say they survived and they demonstrate very good dynamic. Another institution would like to mention, this is ProZorro, the system of public procurement. There are different speculation about how much money they saved. Okay, I would like to say they saved £1 billion because from different statistics there are some about this amount of money. £1 billion are saved from the beginning of this system started to work. It's not bad. It's not bad, but at the same time, of course, ProZorro is not the. It's one of the good instruments to keep money of society, money of budget accountable. But without political will, there are still many ways to manipulate and to steal money from public budget and from public procurements. This is another topic, but institution, I believe, it's one of good examples. Also, we achieved decentralization, and now mayors of big Ukrainian cities are quite important persons. Now mayors of big cities, they have much more money for their programs, for their reforms, and even we can find some proofs of this when president or his first lady, they joined mayors of big cities to have some activity in their cities, to engage there in close entourage, to have their support on elections. Because mayors of big cities, they have very high ratings in their municipalities, like Odessa or Kharkiv or Dnipro or Kiev. All of the cities, they have more than 50% support, mayors of the cities. Medical reform. It just started a few months ago, but this is a big progress comparing what we had before. So we decided to take British system. I know there are a lot of criticism about British system, but current minister, she took this system as a roadmap for changes in medical system. We'll see how successful this reform is, but what I believe is important that there is one person who took responsibility for this, and it's important to allow this person to proceed with the reform, not to create obstacles, but to allow this reform be implemented. And then it can be changed, it can be fixed, but it's much better, it's much better to have 5 years of mistakes than 50 years of sabotage. This is the words of Václav Havel, former president of Czech Republic. Another institutional reform from good news from Ukraine, this is a transparency of state registers. In Ukraine, almost like in Britain, you can open a lot of public information in public registers. As a former journalist, I know how it is important. In Ukraine, you can open special website of Ministry of Justice and find out who is the owner of company, who is the owner of land, who is the owner of property, who is the owner of real estate, and even who is the owner of some cars. It was completely impossible 3-4 years ago. Now this is reality. For society it's important, but also for journalists. They can produce anti-corruption investigation on everyday basis. And they were skillful in this. I believe Ukrainian anti-corruption journalists, they are very powerful. They can produce investigation on every week basis. Then in Britain or in America, journalists can make only once a year and have Pulitzer Prize after this. And doing business improvement also takes place in Ukraine. So Ukraine has some measures, made some steps toward the reform of public service and make Ukrainian business less dependent on public service. Plus, one of the biggest changes from year 2014 that now Ukrainians can travel abroad into Schengen zone without visa, and it also engaged more and more Ukrainians to understand what's the real life in the world, not to be hostage of TV shows or biased public political consultants creating artificial picture of the world to have more profits on elections. Third good news from Ukraine is young generation of Ukrainians. In culture, in art, in IT, in creative industries, in even streetwear, Ukrainian quite successful now. If you visit Kiev or in other big cities, you can find big, let's say, clusters of changes when young Ukrainian engineers can create products for international business, for international companies in area of IT or in area of design and so on and so forth. A lot of advertisement is made by Ukrainian advertising agencies, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe, in Britain. You can find a lot of music clips also made in Ukraine. So this is a golden age or renaissance for Ukrainian creative industries now, and it makes me also optimistic about Ukrainian future. At the same time, Ukraine faces a number of big challenges which will play a very big role on upcoming elections. First of all, this is poverty and migration. So Ukrainians live in Ukraine because of standards of life and because of salary. Last year, in the end of last year, international agency Bloomberg published some numbers that 500,000 Ukrainians left Ukraine into Poland and 300,000 Ukrainians went to Russia. You can imagine that even in the state of undeclared war, Ukrainians live into Russia to have better life. And this is one of the big problems created by weak leadership of Ukraine. I believe this is a poverty, and this is the problem for have security on the street, independent justice, good medical treatment, good education, and so on. People living not because of money, but because of environment, let's say human environment in Ukraine. If you look on the polls, 42% of Ukrainians say that growth of prices is the main problem for them personally. So if they talk about situation in Ukraine, main problems are corruption and war and this. But in personal life of Ukrainians, 42 says growth of prices and 38 says growth of tariffs for heating, for water supply, for gas, and so on. Such social problems creates big room for populism and for radicalization in society. Especially it's dangerous in a situation when there are a big number of paramilitary activists are present in Ukraine, in Ukrainian politics. It creates opportunities for them to fight for their values using weapons, and it can destroy monopoly of government for using weapons. This is one of the challenges which has to be fixed by current Ukrainian government. Another challenge Ukraine is facing now is interference of Russia in electoral process in Ukraine. If it happened here, if it happened in United States, why it cannot happen in Ukraine. Of course, this is one of the main threats for upcoming elections, that Russia will play one of the most negative roles, using different technologies to have pro-Russian candidate on elections as a winner. But at the same time, Ukrainians are quite, let's say, trained to understand what the Russian influence is on the political process, and I believe we will limit this penetration of Russian technologies or money or internet factories of trolls and bots in the political process in Ukraine. Corruption is still one of the challenges Ukraine is facing now, and from one side we have but zero tolerance on corruption about high-level politicians. Society does not accept corruption. If there is some corrupt scandals, people starting to, let's say, negative reaction on this. And in such situation, politicians who are involved in corruption becomes very toxic. And this is one of the achievements. At the same time, on low level or on the level of regular life, people still very loyal toward corruption in their personal relations with government or with local authorities or with law enforcement agencies. And to deal with such problem, possible only not just creation the institution to fight against corruption, but through education, through public relations programs, through advertisement of non-acceptance of corruption, and so on and so forth. And in this situation, we have now all these problems create kind of fatigue outside Ukraine, but also inside Ukraine, when Ukrainian citizens become more and more negative about politics at all. So they are negative, they don't trust politicians, they would stay at home instead of participating in electoral process. And outside Ukraine, there are challenges we are facing now. It's Ukrainian fatigue in European Union, changes of power in Italy, when such Ukrainian fatigue can push issue of sanctions against Russia. And we have changes of minds about Ukraine in Hungary and Poland. I'm surprised, but now it's maybe the first time since Ukrainian independence when our Western neighbors also have negative approach on Ukraine. And such happened because of different problems, not only inside Ukraine, not only because of Ukrainian fatigue, but also because of problems in their societies. But what is important that Ukrainian political leadership has to deal with this. They have to pay attention on this topic. They cannot just ignore it and keep situation as it is now. Instead of being involved in corruption, better to pay much more time, much more attention for the situation on border with Hungary or with Poland, to negotiate with our neighbors and to find the way how to normalize these relations. Ukraine is facing election in the next 18 months, and for short-term agenda we have such problems like very small room for reforms. So to have reforms now is very difficult in Parliament because populism and preparation for electoral process dictate the agenda in Ukraine. Also, we have to finish our anti-corruption reform, we have to finish our anti-corruption infrastructure. It means to establish anti-corruption court. It's quite unusual, especially in Britain, to have some special court for anti-corruption cases, but in Ukraine we don't have another option. Our judicial system is corrupt, and it made anti-corruption bureau hostage of the situation when anti-corruption investigation cannot proceed through the court. For instance, last year in March there was a big story about head of fiscal service Mr. Nasirov, who was arrested, and now he is charged. There is indictment against him, but our judicial system became his very loyal partner, and as for today, after all procedure measures, there is still process blocked by court. So instead of start the investigation in the court decided to read his indictment few pages per day and then have 1 month's break. So it will take few maybe years only to read his indictment. This is kind of technology to postpone the process, to postpone the process in the court. But why it happened? Because judicial system is also corrupt. The same happened when Anti-Corruption Bureau asked to change there are some cases about mayor of Odessa, Mr. Trukhanov, and Anti-Corruption Bureau investigate this case. And they asked to temporarily block his mandate as a mayor. But traditional judicial system, they also did not make this step. And today, Mr. Trukhanov, mayor of Odessa, he is under investigation. At the same time, he is acting mayor of Odessa, and he cooperates with another witness or another charged person in this case. So of course it can destroy the whole investigation, because if you investigate somebody, this person should not have access to another persons under investigation. Also, for next time, for next election, we have to change electoral legislation. Our electoral system is very corrupt. Why? Because this system allows corrupt money come into politics. So if you want to be politician, you just can pay money to the voters. In Ukraine, it is reality, unfortunately to say this, but the only way to change it is to cancel the system of majoritarian voters, when people can vote for one individual and then to make this individual member of parliament for next 5 years, to steal money from budget and to enrich themselves through the politics. But again, this was promised 4 years ago by president, by current coalition, but lack of political will did not make this reform possible. And now, when we have less than 1 year before presidential elections, it's much more difficult to push this reform forward. This is one of the problems we will face in very soon. Also, we have to proceed with electronic declaration for civil society. This is still one of the main topics in dialogue between Ukraine and European Union. Ukraine has to cancel the system of prosecution of civil society leaders. Land market and privatization. It's very low chance to implement this reform in the time we have before elections. But without these reforms, it's almost impossible to restart the engine of Ukrainian economy, to have economic program with more and more money from investors coming in Ukraine. And another problem is still not fixed is State Bureau of Investigation. We established one of new law enforcement agencies, but because of, again, lack of political will, this state Bureau of Investigation did not start to work. It's very difficult to imagine how to finish the reform without this State Bureau of Investigation. And I think Ukraine has to do this, but without new election, it's almost impossible to do. What to do, what Ukraine can do, what Ukraine is looking for Britain, for the United Kingdom. So we still need your support from international organization, from IMF, from G7 and G20, and your support allowed us to make a lot of reforms. Without your support, it would be much more difficult to have even such achievement I mentioned before. Also, Ukraine is looking for visit of Prime Minister of United Kingdom to Kiev, which can be a signal of political support of Ukraine in this difficult time. And also it's very important to change the visa regime, visa system. We are not asking for cancelling of visa, but at least we are asking to have consulate in Kiev, because now it's just disaster how Ukrainians applying for British visa. All documents travel from Ukraine to Poland and sometimes even to Sheffield to have visa approval. And it takes not weeks, but sometimes months. And the level of negative replies on visa applications is very high, one of the highest. Maybe Canada can compete with Britain with a number of negative answers on Ukrainian applications. And maybe not the last, but not least but not last is but not least is investigation of money laundering in Britain. You know that Ukrainian oligarchs and corrupt elites, they use Britain jurisdiction for keeping money, for money laundering, for acquiring property, and cases like One Hyde Park apartment of Renat Akhmetov or Brompton Road metro station of Dmitry Firtash. It's just examples when money from Ukrainian politics came into United Kingdom to create special personal paradise for Ukrainian oligarchs, but the nature of this money of Ukrainian citizens. And without support of British law enforcement agencies, it's almost impossible to investigate such cases. And after election, I believe we will have new round of such investigation, because Ukrainian society will not support such status quo when oligarchs can take money from Ukraine and spend them abroad. And it will create new desire of society to investigate such cases, and there is no chance to avoid this for new leadership of Ukraine. Ukrainian reforms can be a good case studies for countries around us, for post-Soviet countries like Moldova and Georgia, when Ukraine created anti-corruption bureau as a new agency to fight against high-level corruption, which is not created in Moldova, for instance. And that is why in this country much less awareness of society on corruption. Also, inclusiveness of civil society in the process of changes is very important, and our dynamic here, one of the best examples for post-Soviet world. To build anti-corruption institutions from the zero level is a good example how to avoid this intoxication of corruption in new institutions. And also inclusiveness of international advisors and international community for selection process of judges or anti-corruption law enforcement agency is also Ukraine can provide for international experience. In this sense, Ukraine is a good example when our achievements can be studied and then used. In situation we have now, Ukraine still the country, as I mentioned, on the crossroad, and quite possible Ukraine can be Eastern European tiger or miracle, but at the same time there is a chance that Ukraine can be gray zone between Europe and post-Soviet world, and we have to do our homework at home, but we're still looking for your support in our changes, and your support is not less important. Sometimes it's very important to make our changes irreversible and successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergei, for what I thought was an excellent talk. We will open the floor to Q&As, but perhaps let me abuse my position and start with the first couple of questions. The first one, as a non-Ukrainian, looking at it's okay, I've got the microphone.
No, we need it for the video.
Okay. As a non-Ukrainian, following the protests a few years ago, I was absolutely fascinated to see people protesting, risking their lives, facing death sometimes, holding EU flags. That's a very powerful image for those of us who study the European Union, and you were there. I just wanted to ask you, for you personally, what did Europe mean? What did the association with the European Union mean during these?
It's very different. For people who study politics or who are journalists, it's something different for regular people. For regular people, flag of Europe means European salaries and opportunities or possibilities to travel abroad without visas. So it's very simplified, but very, clear what people want to have with this flag. Level of life like in Europe, and freedoms to travel abroad, to have their opinion, to have their values, not to be attacked for these values and so on. For people who are more involved in the process, of course, it means legislation, changes of legislation, or completely different ideals in the politics. But again, very high expectation created the big disaster for politicians who took power 4 years ago, because expectations were so high that it was almost impossible to implement them. But if at least people who took responsibility for the country, they demonstrated their personal readiness to sacrifice themselves for changes, it would be different. But when people see then, from one side, president is ready to declare European values, from another side, he is ready to steal money from state budget, it can not only suppress or destroy his rating, but it can also destroy the reputation of European flag, because everything is going on under this flag. That is why we have quite, not dangerous, but not very sympathetic process on the south and eastern regions when former cronies of Mr. Yanukovych restore their support. I don't believe they can win elections, but they will have quite high result on next elections. Because, again, expectations were so high and behavior of leadership was so bad.
Sure. That leads me to my second and final question, which is this constituency within Ukraine, which does not share the same vision as yourself or perhaps the current government. And I'm talking about people in Ukraine who see the future more closely connected with Russia than they do it more closely connected with the EU, with the West. And I wanted to ask, and again, going beyond the stereotype that all of them are cronies of Putin or Putin's proxies in Ukraine. What is it that make people so uneasy about the prospect of the Ukrainian boat shifting away from Russia? And what can the government do, and people like you do, to reassure them that their own values and their own opinions will be respected?
You know, this is quite, again, interesting phenomena when from one side we have Russia state as aggressor, occupied Ukrainian territory and killed 10,000 Ukrainian citizens. But from another side, there is a still high respect of Ukrainians toward Russians as a nation, as a people-to-people relations, as a Russia culture and so on. And this is another gap between political leadership and society. Because what happened in politics? My personal opinion, but I think it's quite relevant. Current president was elected as a liberal president, promising peace, promising reforms, investors, fight against corruption. But he lost this chance to implement this agenda. What is he doing now? He is looking for new core electorate, core voters to be re-elected. And he shifted from this agenda of liberal reforms toward the agenda of Russian aggression, military protection of Ukraine, using camouflage uniform, and so on and so forth. And this agenda of leadership is quite far away from agenda of society, which is looking for peaceful resolution, which is looking for, again, anti-corruption fight, which is looking for a normalization of business environment in country, and so on. And each new step creates more disappointment in general in society, because society still, as I mentioned, is quite loyal toward not Russian state but Russian people. Millions of Ukrainians have relatives or friends living in Russia. As I mentioned, 300,000 Ukrainians run from Ukraine to Russia for money, not as refugees but as a labor force. During last 2 years in the wartime, it means that still Ukrainians quite open for restoring relations with Russia. And such decision of president to describe each, not just Russian citizen, but everything connected with Russia as an enemy, it creates this gap in society. It divides society. Manafort advised Yanukovych to do the same. He proposed him to divide society on language topic, on religion topic, on the topic of integration and so on, to create core voters and then to expand this core. But I think this technology would not work this time.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. Let's take a few questions. If you can keep them short, unlike me, and we'll try and cluster them in two, and then we'll let Sergei answer them.
Thank you.
Just wait for the microphone to come your way, because otherwise the recording won't work.
My question's about the elections next year, and it's in two parts, I suppose. I know you mentioned that the period of election campaigning can prevent anti-corruption measures or campaigns against corruption. To what extent do you think that, dependent on the result next year, that fight against corruption will completely halt? Do you think that there's a possibility that that could happen? And I suppose secondary to that is, what for you, from an anti-corruption perspective, is a good result next year for Ukraine's perspective?
The good result. Let's gather one more, okay. And then you wanted to ask a question on the back?
Can I return to your political sandwich, which was very interesting? So taking that first layer, and I don't think it's working, but looking at that first layer of people, which is ordinary people. For recording, it's for recording. Looking at that first layer of strata of society, there is a high expectation of leadership, politicians, and the institution. Maybe the expectations in Ukraine are much higher than they are in this country, because they expect their politicians to bring the reforms. So there is a short patience in Ukraine of the leadership, and what we've seen with the Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan, is that things can change very quickly if the government and the institutions do not perform and increase the economic level of people in Ukraine. My question is, and this is not my idea, this is something that has come out of discussions in Kiev with private individuals. The expectations are now getting to a stage where there is a strong possibility that there will be another Euromaidan in Ukraine, that they are unhappy with what's happening now, and if there is a generation of young, clean, energetic, national, patriotic politicians, that there could be a serious change in Ukraine.
Yeah, we had President Yushchenko who liked these long answers. I will try to not to repeat his experience. In the sense of fight against corruption next year, I think it will be the same as it is now. So I don't predict any dramatic changes, neither like to make it fast and successful, nor to wrap up all changes. So it will be situation like now. The whole year we will very slowly adopt anti-corruption court, for instance. So anti-corruption court is necessary to finish this infrastructure of fight against corruption. If we had positive good will of president, we adopted this law a year ago. And today we would not discuss amendments or how much time it will take more to finish this, but we would discuss first decision of this court to put corrupt individuals into jail and to take money back into budget. But without this will, we have what we have now. So in this situation, the idea of president is postpone as much as possible the implementation of this anti-corruption court. Last week, this week in Parliament, so we lost last week, and we started to hearing on anti-corruption court only on Wednesday this week. and it will take maybe 1 week more. Now we have pause or break for 1 week, so we will start in the beginning of June. And the law maybe will be adopted in the middle of June. It means that it will take few weeks more to sign, to publish. So what President doing, he is winning the time. He make it as late as possible, not to have any problems before elections happened, presidential elections happened. And he is quite successful with this manipulation. Because, I repeat, we lost last year. This year can be a year of successful implementation of this law, but no, unfortunately. What can be success for fight against corruption? For next year, this is first decision of the court, first imprisonment of high-rank corrupt individuals. But it's quite impossible because all cases, they go to our regular corrupt judicial system. So NABU is producing new investigation, but all of them go to traditional court, not to the anti-corruption court. It means that it will be difficult to have successful result on fight against corruption during next 18 months, because everything gonna be connected with elections. But I would like to say some people in jail. So if they're in jail, like Martynenko, for instance, one of the biggest beneficiaries of corruption of current leadership of Ukraine, current government, very close to former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, but also to current President Poroshenko as well, who was just stealing money from energy sector, from nuclear power station business, doing this very brutally and open. Such people have to pay the price. And your question about new Maidan and expectation of this protest, I say it's very, very low chance for new Maidan for next years. Why? Because last revolution is not connected in people's minds with good news. It's connected with devaluation of national currency for 200%. This revolution connected with people dying on the east and occupation of Crimea, and this is connected with very slow economic recovery and lost jobs of people. In such situation, of course, it's a big barrier for people to join street protest. For me, as a politician, it's bad news, because with such street support, we can achieve much more in parliament. But we had experience in the end of last year, in the beginning of this year, when a group of politicians tried to push changes forward, including Saakashvili. People did not join this protest. There were some few thousand people on the streets each weekend when this protest took place, but it's not enough. We need to have hundreds of thousands to make this protest to make this momentum from the protest to the changes. Because reputation of street protest is very poor now in Ukraine. And also people are so sick and tired with politicians who are promising but not implementing this, that they don't want to join. It's a bad because to have readiness of people to join the protest, it will make current leadership less self-confidence, and they will not doing these things they're doing so brutal, so open, like stealing money or manipulating for personal interest by government or parliament and so on. But reality as it is now, we have quite slow recovery of society after last revolution. So if it happened, maybe in next 10 years, 7 years, not now.
Okay, there's another question.
Unless next president will make such big mistake, I don't know.
Thank you. I was just wondering, given the kind of current political climate throughout Europe, especially of kind of populist leaders, I'm thinking about Viktor Orban especially here, who kind of are very focused on sovereignty, ideas of kind of nationalism. when you made reference to kind of using the European Union as the carrot and the stick to push Ukrainian kind of in society effectively in the direction you want it to go and you think it would be good to go, do you not think that that's potentially quite kind of cosmopolitan and liberal and actually might be problematic, and that it will inspire sort of populist leaders and resentment in society more generally?
Yeah, Sergei, thank you for the speech. I have one question. Mass protests are one thing, but the building of a genuine political alternative which might challenge the old forces from within the institutions is another. Why are you guys, so the genuinely young, democratic, alternative politicians, why weren't you able in the last years to build a genuine political party?
We don't have another option. We need support of European Union to make changes possible. Believe me, if there were not carrot of visa liberalization, a lot of reforms were blocked in Parliament or in presidential office. Only this carrot allowed us to implement anti-corruption reform or reform of healthcare system and so on and so forth. Of course, now Europe is changing very fast. These changes are very fast going on, but we cannot declare another integration. We don't have option to integrate Ukraine into Eurasia Union, because for Ukraine, historical choice was done on the revolution 4 years ago, and because Ukrainian society does not support another integration, and because Ukraine is connected by values and by historical background with Europe. So in this situation, we're still looking for such support, but we understand that let's say, room for this support is less and less, because it's bad to say, but we're facing now changes of generation in European politics as well. Current chancellor in Germany, I totally agree with you, was one of the most pro-European leader from maybe Second World War, pro-Ukrainian leader, sorry, pro-European but pro-Ukrainian as well. And if current chancellor leaves her position in Germany, we cannot predict what will do next chancellor. And the same in US. Current president, US was traditionally a big friend of Ukraine, but current president is very unpredictable, and to understand his maneuver is very difficult. That is why from time to time we're gonna hear such scandals, which was a few days ago here in Britain when BBC found out that the Ukrainian president paid $500,000 for the meeting with president of US. But it's not normal. It's not normal to have such relations. And it's another bad news for Ukraine, these changes of European or American moods. It's also the time for Ukrainians to understand that main actors in this fight for better futures are Ukrainians themselves, not Europeans. It's very important to help, but if Ukrainians don't want to make these changes, nobody will do this. And your question was about new political unity. I believe it's gonna happen on next election. It didn't happen last time in 2014 because there were very fast campaign, very short campaign, 2 months campaign, and there were last time it was legislation of Yanukovych for election when promised reform of electoral system was not conducted by current president. He promised this, but he did not implement his promise on 2014. And we had elections based on current system, which means that money is still playing a very important role. Doesn't matter in party list election or constituency election. We still have a hope that this system gonna be changed. At least the threshold can be lower, not a 5%, but maybe less, to open the gate, to open the door for new politicians to join politics. But also we are looking forward for voting in second hearing for electoral reform. At least to have to lose illusion and to know that there is no change is going to happen next election. But we need to vote. Of course, President and his team, they don't want to have it because such voting will make big problem for them. Either they vote for changes and they lose opportunity to be re-elected to have such many representatives as they have now, or they vote against and they will have very low profile coverage in media abroad and so on. But I believe doesn't matter will we change electoral system or not, the unity of new people joining politics plus people who are staying in front of the door now and gonna join politics on new election is gonna happen. Because this movement, it will not be stopped. And I want to repeat that as much we have from new generation politics as less people from old generation. This is very important to engage more and more Ukrainians, civil society leaders, journalists, and anti-corruption activists in political process.
Okay, thanks very much. There was a question in here.
It's indeed a follow-up on what you've just said on the future political force, but I'm curious on what also political base you think the force you will join would be based, because sometimes it's difficult for us to understand because we have a lot of new bright people who are fighting corruption, who are for reforms, but often they have very different and diverse views. Somebody would be very conservative, somebody would have totally different views on the economy, and that's why for the voters it's extremely confusing to vote for just for the bunch of the good people with totally different policies. So it's interesting, for instance, in your case, what the political force would be, what it would stand for.
Can we just get one more question? I'm very worried that I've left my colleague Ola wanting to asking a question last time, and I don't want to be seen as the bad guy here. So,
It's too late. So actually, it's a connected. So I have two very short. So you're part of the generation of two revolutions, right? We, and Natalia is as well, and some other people that have left us. So we lived through two revolutions. First, we became professionals. You became a professional. You became a journalist, one of the best investigative journalists in Ukraine. And then after the second revolution, all these professionals that were now in their 30s decided, no, we have to maybe go into politics and be more serious. So a lot of people that have given up really impressive careers to go into politics, and there's a group of you in Parliament, right, and in NGOs as well. But and you said in your speech, the new faces, and some of them are not necessarily good, yeah. And I want you to tell us a little bit about the pressures of coming into the political system as, for instance, a person from a journalism background. How was that like? And explain to us what are the potential hurdles that you had to overcome, but also maybe where are the places that people did not overcome those hurdles. And second, what was interesting when you said you were speaking about Russia and that Ukrainians, like Russians, but not perhaps the leadership or the regime. And then it came to me that perhaps, although the last little bit didn't work out so well, but at the same time, Ukraine has been managing Russia for quite some time. So perhaps Ukrainians yourself have some advice to the rest of the EU on how to manage Russia. Maybe some things that Ukrainians have learned in the past through their interactions that did work in keeping Russia at bay.
Okay, there will be a final round of questions after Sergei answered this one. So just think about it, and then we'll come back to it.
Make my answer short, and then we can.
Yes, we'll have. Right.
Okay. So to be short, my question, my answer on Natalia's question is ideology. I'm liberal, so I'm not gonna stay for people attacking LGBT activists or freedom of speech and other values we are sharing. At the same time, ideology in the modern world is very, mixture material. So, of course, there are different people with different views, but my personal opinion that we need some more liberal-oriented people in politics. you know, Ukraine is neighbor of Russia for maybe historically it's like for 400-500 years period. But at the same time, it's very difficult to say how to deal with Russia successfully. They understand the language of power, of course, the language of muscles. And at the same time, it's not the answer for small and weak countries. If you don't have muscles, it doesn't matter how wise is your advice, because without muscles you cannot resist them. Of course, they have this huge nostalgia on. They have nostalgia on Soviet time, but the same have this nostalgia on territorial wideness when they was so huge country in empire time. The best way to deal with them is to increase your muscles, of course. There is no another answer. But in Ukrainian case, you know, this is so simple to say, make you more powerful. But Ukraine is still not very good example for this, because Ukraine can be much stronger if Ukraine fight against corruption, if Ukraine save money and use this money for personal strongness instead of enrich oligarchs and corrupt politicians. In this situation, advice for countries is not just to increase muscles, but to make this homework, to change the rules of the game in the politics, to make it cleaner, to make your country successful. And I don't believe Russia can attack successful country recognized by European Union as a member of family, or NATO, of course. But again, we have this hybrid world when Russia cannot just attack by occupying territory, but create cyber attack or just keeping some people as hostages, as it happened with Estonians. Increase your strongness and make your homework. Maybe it's advice. And no, there was one more question about people joined politics from civil society. Expectations was very different. My personal expectation was that reform will dictate agenda. Reform-minded people will take responsibility for the process. But no, you know, even you people who joined politics after Revolution of Dignity, very often they are oriented on personal profits. This is because of weak leadership and weak institutions. If there is opportunity to steal money, a lot of people would not resist this opportunity. They will join the process of stealing. And especially if your leadership, if your president keep your business as usual and even participate in the process. So my personal experience, we could achieve much more with a strong leadership, oriented not on personal profits, but on reform agenda.
Mm-hmm. We will take all questions now. Be economical with how you express them. And there was one starting here.
Yeah. Quick comment on the question.
Just if you can only do the question and leave the comment for after.
Yeah. You in your list of positive achievements, you didn't mention. I was interested. You didn't mention and I'd like to hear your opinion about them. The 4 decommunization laws from 2015. I ask that question for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the Ukraine has now one of the best and most open access to Soviet archives in all of the former communist countries, which I think is an achievement. And also because the decommunization laws are controversial amongst some Western academics who wrote an open letter criticizing them. So I'm wondering, what is your opinion about these?
Yes, Sergei, you mentioned that the special bond between the Ukrainian society and Russia, the Russian society, the Russian state, the Russian economy. And I was wondering whether there are some practical steps that the Ukrainian Parliament is taking in order to balance this tension that there is between pro-Ukrainian, pro-EU, or pro-Russian, pro-EU, or pro-Russian, anti-Russian tendencies in the Ukrainian society, or if you have any recommendations. Well,
which
if, well, for instance, the language policy, it might have backfired. So if there are any initiatives towards, making peace towards this tension that might divide the population, or recommendations?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to ask. Yeah, you have mentioned before that in order to deal with Russia, it is important to show muscles. Do you not think that for the European Union, accelerating a process of Ukraine integration would be a perhaps too excessive way of showing muscles?
I have a very brief question about the anti-corruption court. Like, how would you assess foreign judges being the part of anti-corruption court? Do we need them, or can we work without them and without foreign judges there?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the reasons of Maidan was to get rid of the clan system of the government, the corrupted clan system. But what we see now is that a lot of old faces from the old system are still working in the government on all levels and all branches. So a lot of them were not very effective in doing their jobs throughout the history. And even if you look in the upcoming elections, all of the candidates are the old faces, and people do not really have new choices. So as a young Ukrainian and young specialist, I encounter a problem of I really want to come back to Ukraine and do an impact in developing the country, but I realize that I have much more potential in the career in anything but my own country, because my own country doesn't allow myself to be led into anything serious, because I'm from a new generation, I'm young, and I'm not part of the system. So what do you think needs to happen to make the old people from old system understand that this was enough, and probably they have to leave to let somebody else to do a better job? Thank you.
Go ahead. Okay. May I ask a question regarding that moving towards European Union? And the point is that many people, when they were fighting at Maidan, they were thinking about European salaries. And you are also mentioning that for 42% of people, that money is a major motivation. So, and like in European Union, you have Germany with German salaries, and for example, you have Latvia with Latvian salaries. And it is both are European salaries, and both are very different. So my question is, if Ukraine join European Union, what are the unique features in Ukrainian economy which will make it successful, like second Germany, but not second Latvia?
I have two questions actually, but I'll ask the one. With regards to liberal democracy, there is this increasing talk about the liberal turn that we're experiencing in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. And there was this quote by a notorious political scientist who said, now that Eastern Europe is free from the alien ideology of communism, it can turn to the right and return to its true path, fascism. This is a very notorious and infamous political scientist that said it. Obviously, it's Samuel Huntington. How is this democratic backsliding that we're seeing in Hungary, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, how is that perceived in Ukraine?
Okay. Let's leave it there. It's a big enough question to answer as it is. Please, let's before we give the floor to Sergei, is there anyone here under the age of 20 that would like to ask a question? We will make a special allowance for that. No? Right, over to Sergei.
Okay, so decommunization. We have one person who work on the street which was renamed. Natalia, you work on the street which was renamed. What was the impact of the renaming on your life?
No, my point is our street was renamed from the Tsarist. It was decommunized. Suvorov was decommunized. Yes. I still can't puzzle while the Tsarist Marshall had been dehumanized. He was never been a communist, so it's still kind of, I don't have an answer to that. So that, it's
but
not easy.
how the change of the name changed your life?
So we have to undergo with our organization for the numerous juridical procedures to change it in all our documents. So we've taken it costed us some money and it costed us some effort, but it didn't change my mind. My life. But obviously, besides of being the taxi drivers being confused extremely. But the point is that, I said, maybe there would be some notorious guys, really notorious, if that would be, I don't know, Kaganovich or somebody. But in these kind of things, we don't have this kind of, streets any longer. But with these smaller guys, I doubt.
So my answer is decommunization is not a reform. That is why I did not mention. And unfortunately, this is very often used as a populistic way of current leadership to present themselves as a big patriots. But in my understanding, patriot is not the leader who renames the street, but the leader who does not steal money from budget. It's much more difficult, but maybe it has much more impact on the life of society. And okay, let's go to another question. Current Parliament sometimes makes these steps in populistic way to demonstrate the patriotism again. And my personal opinion, I would prefer not to touch these issues at all, to have a moratorium for renaming the street, for renaming the cities, for renaming to demolishing monuments, and to changes in language policy. Because these topics only divide society without additional value. And this is the same technology which was used by Yanukovych again. I would like to repeat. But Yanukovych uses another direction to play this game with pro-Russian people. Current is playing the game with pro-Ukrainian, pro-patriotic people. But society is much more difficult institution, much more difficult body. And you cannot just divide society, make this gap between different parts of society bigger, wider, just because you want to be re-elected. And just because you don't want to stop stealing money from budget, but you want to present something. And you decide to present new names of the streets instead of another reforms. In this sense, current coalition headed by current leadership makes some steps to make this gap bigger in society. That is why I'm in favor of moratorium. Anti-corruption court with the foreign judges, it's not necessary. So we have experience with anti-corruption bureau without foreign detectives. So some institutions like FBI, they have cooperation agreement with anti-corruption bureau, they have exchange of information. The same can be with the judges. Ukrainian judges can be fair and independent, as we have independent detectives in anti-corruption bureau, or as we have independent, even independent prosecutors, like in the Department of Maidan crimes. So Ukrainians can rule the country by themselves, but it can be different Ukrainians. Expertise of international judges can be useful. Even I can say for anti-corruption court, their role can be crucial to make selection process independent. So all debates about anti-corruption court from last few months, who will have the right to select judges? And idea of president to use his controlled by himself institution to select judges for anti-corruption court. Our idea is to establish independent international commission to select judges for anti-corruption court. And of course, after this, we heard screaming, saying, this is against Ukrainian constitution, this is against Ukrainian sovereignty. Of course, such arguments can be used to protect vested interests very often. So there were questions about European salaries and how to make Ukraine new Germany, but not new Latvia. This is very ambitious, you know. It's impossible to become new Germany without being new Latvia, you know. So maybe this road is very long. And before you become new Germany, you would be sometime new Latvia as well. But for Ukraine, even to have Latvian salaries, it can be a good achievement. I don't like the politicians saying that Ukraine will join G7, Ukraine will join G20. So Yanukovych was saying this as a political agenda. Ukraine going to be member of G20. Come on, guys, it's just bullshit. You can sell this to very primitive people saying that Ukraine will join G20. But if we make Ukraine like new Slovenia, it can be a good achievement. If we make Ukrainian level of life in Ukraine like in Estonia, it can be a good achievement. Don't talk about G20 with me, because it's very fake propaganda. You can sell this only for people who don't follow the news in the world. And in this sense, Ukraine is a country which has a lot of things to propose for the Europe. And it's not only agricultural facilities, but agricultural facilities are great in Ukraine, but also IT facilities, IT institutions, IT people. They also can be one of the engines of these reforms in Ukrainian economy. If you visit Kiev, you can find a lot of hidden places where new people sitting and just making their job. And very often this job is sold to the international companies without brand made in Ukraine. But this is not only clothing, which is made in Ukraine, but very often this IT code made in Ukraine. Ukraine has options to be successful with under the strong and reform-oriented leadership. I believe in this. And process in European Union in Ukraine, it's like, let's say it's a pain, because, you know, for us, as I mentioned, European Union was a flagship. So we look on the European Union as the goal we are going to. We are going toward this goal. It's a lighthouse for reforms. And of course, we are simplifying this, especially in everyday basis conversation, that we want to be like Europe. And when we talk about this, we talk about Britain and Germany, not about Hungary or Latvia, in sense of changes, in sense of success. So the orientation is a high level of life and respectful relations in society. In this case, when we have such problems in Poland and in Hungary, it does not suppress reputation of European Union in the eyes of Ukrainians. Not all of them are really follow the news from Poland or Hungary.
But is the EU seen as hypocritical, as having double standards, as...
I will say this way, that for Ukrainians to be European means to have high standards, to have opportunity to travel in the world, to have high-level education and healthcare system. They don't follow in these details. For us as politicians, it's challenge to see the changes in European Union, because we are losing our close partners and friends. Very often, we don't even understand how deep the changes are, especially like countries like Italy. In Ukraine, only few people understand what is going on in Italy, but Italy is one of the crucial countries in European Union and in G7, and these changes will reflect a lot of things maybe in future. Or what is going on in German, like in CDU, like who will be successor of Chancellor Merkel, which orientation she or he will have. So not really a lot of people understand this. That is why for Ukraine, changes are connected with the brand of European Union as a brand, not as a some process inside the European countries. Ukrainian would be happy to join, I think, but
I mean, what would stop younger Ukrainians after, like, next day after joining European Union, immigrate?
Ukrainians can travel You can travel now, not just for tourism, but for money, for salaries. So if you look on the website of Poznan City Council, they have Ukrainian version. And this is not about sightseeing, it's about how to apply for work in Poznan. It's legal. It's legal, of course it's legal. Yes, for Ukrainians, especially in Poland. No, it's
in Poland, somewhere near the border, but I'm talking about Germany. I mean, what would stop Ukrainian?
So Poland replacing Polish people travel to Britain or Germany by Ukrainians, and it's totally legal. And now we have this migration, not into Germany, but in Poland, especially in Poland and some neighbor country, for have this seasonal work, and a lot of them coming back to Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, you know, people, this new wave of migration, I can say it's a seasonal wave. So people travel maybe for 1 year, for 2 years. They not travel to Europe as they traveled after Second World War. I cannot say that these people are lost for Ukraine forever. No. So people, let me say again, people who are living Ukraine now for better life, they are living this not forever. Our country not forever. They are living to come back maybe in few years when they take more money from their business here and then come back to establish some business in Ukraine, or to open some business in Ukraine, or to buy property in Ukraine. I don't have a feeling that these Ukrainians are living Ukraine forever. This is my opinion. Why they can live? You know, even if you're Ukrainian, you live in Ukraine, you don't understand something before you leave Ukraine to live in countries abroad. Of course, Ukraine has not the excellent system of healthcare or maybe ecology or salary, but at the same time, taxation for private entities in Ukraine is very low, 5%. You cannot find such taxation anywhere in Europe. So it's like internal offshore zone. To establish private entity and to have 5% of taxation. But it's not a joke, it's true. And it's very, I don't agree with the argument that it's difficult to run such private entity. It's not difficult. It's very easy to report in tax office. It's really very low taxation, and this is a legal way to have big, let's say, big success in your private business. And I know not hundreds, but maybe 1,000 private entities creating businesses, jobs, and living this life. That is why they can come back to Ukraine, because you cannot find 5% taxation here. You cannot find opportunities Ukraine provides, because Ukrainian market is not, it's a big market, but there is really not a lot players. Like, let's talk about clothing. So people want to eat, people want to have clothing. Market of food is divided, but it's still big opportunity to produce new food and to sell it. But if you're talking about clothing, it's totally empty. There is only import. If you're successful with your brains to establish big company in clothing, you can create big company in Ukraine. Starting from 5% taxation and small entity, but then to have company like Reserved in Poland, because it's, again, huge market with people looking for clothing every day. And the same with IT, the same with different spheres. I cannot say that if you live in Ukraine, you're a loser, no. Even sometimes it's even more successful than to live abroad. And at the same time, you have no connection with politics and with government. So you can be private business person in Ukraine with a good success.
Let's draw a line here. Before I formally thank Sergei for what I thought was an excellent event, let me just take this opportunity to thank my colleague and friend Ola Onuk for organizing a fantastic 2-day event. What you saw now was the culmination of some very interesting discussion over the last 2 days. So thanks very much for putting that together, Ola. We appreciate it. And let me also take this opportunity to help Fadil Ersoze, who is the administrator of the center, who will be leaving us at the end of this year after 3 brilliant years of service with us. So we are also grateful for your support and your help over these years. But of course, our special thanks go to Sergei for coming all this way and giving such an interesting talk, and for you for being so patient and asking only one question, many but only one, which was great. So once again, Sergei, thank you very much for coming to Manchester.